Well, this grammar is probably the most requested review that I've had. I mean, more of you have been asking about this grammar than any other grammar in terms of like asking me to do a review of it. So here we go. How good is it? What's it like? Well, let's find out together. Let's roll it. Like so many of the reviews that I do here, I have a huge amount of respect for the people who are actually creating and writing these grammars. And Dr. Black is certainly no exception to that. He's been in the space for a very long time. He knows, he's forgotten more than I know. He's a smart guy, just like Dr. Plummer and all these other people who who I get the privilege of looking at their grammars. So I don't want you to sort of think that what I say about any given grammar is the end of the story. There are pros and cons of every grammar. There is no perfect grammar. And if you're really interested in learning and figuring out which grammar is ideal for you, unless you're a teacher, you're probably just not going to be able to. So all I can really do is to give you my view of these different grammars, what I appreciate about them, what I find, what I believe to be perhaps shortcomings or distractions or whatever it happens to be, and the benefits of them. And so that's what I want to do again with Dr. Black's Learn New Testament Greek. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing the third edition of this workbook, or of this grammar, released by Broadman and Holman in 2009. Now, this grammar is intended to be linguistically informed, and indeed Dr. Black has already written a number of books and edited a number of books around the subject of linguistics, even prior to the third edition of this grammar being released. So this book has got somebody behind it who understands the linguistics of the New Testament. And so that knowledge and that understanding flows into the grammar itself. As for the grammar itself, it's written in about 26 chapters, and each chapter has a number of different sections in it, and each of these are numbered sequentially from 1 to 176. So whereas a lot of grammars, what they'll do is they'll have, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 2.1, 2.3, and so they'll break the chapters up that way. This one just has a sequential numbering, which is neither here nor there from a learning point of view, but I just found that kind of interesting. At least this way, it's easy for a teacher to refer back to a particular section, regardless of whether the user, the learner, is using like the Kindle edition with no page numbers or a Logos edition or physical copy. It's easy to find which section you're referring to using a system like this. And so a lot of grammars today have this kind of approach. A couple of distinctions when it comes to this grammar and how it's laid out. First of all, I love how the author, Dr. Black, he puts the verbs very early. In fact, in chapter 2, you got the alphabet in chapter 1, and chapter 2 you're into verbs. I think this is the way to go because the verb really is the centerpiece of the entire Greek clausal structure. And so introducing that early, not only does it introduce you to, the building block of language really quickly, but it also introduces you to, gets you, into a space where you are orienting yourself around that main building block of the Greek sentence. So I'm a big fan of having verbs introduced very early, and most grammars, to be fair, do this. I think it's really because I started with something like mounts, which was, where you don't get to verbs until about chapter 16, 15, 16. That's kind of really not the norm. The norm is to get into verbs a little bit earlier. Another thing that is different between this grammar and the basics of biblical Greek by Mounts, which is also the same as Dr. Merkel and Dr. Plummer's approach, is the way it approaches nouns. Now, most grammars, when they approach nouns, they're going to talk about first and second declension nouns in the nominative and the accusative, and then in the following chapter, they'll often talk about genitive and dative nouns in first and second declension nouns, but the genitive and dative. So you're introducing, the first chapter, you're introducing really the subject of the sentence and the object of the sentence, and the next chapter, you're introducing the modifiers of the different elements of the sentence. So normally it's going to be genitive and dative. So that's the way most grammars will approach this. So they will have nominative and accusative and genitive and dative. But this grammar, along with Dr. Merkel and Plummer's grammar, they approach it differently. They start with first declension nouns, nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative in one chapter, and then the next chapter, second declension nouns, nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative. Now, there are pros and cons of this. On the pro side, you're dealing with the endings, all right? So first declension nouns have similar endings, second declension nouns have similar endings. So in that sense, you're understanding how the words themselves fit with the endings. But the con with this, I think, is that you're introducing the reader, the student, to all these cases at one time. And in my experience, it's that introduction to different cases that can actually be quite confusing. But having said that, as I've been going through Dr. Plummer and Merkel's grammar over the last couple of weeks, I haven't found this to be a big issue. So there's pros and cons. Like I said here, on the one hand, you're learning all these cases at once, but on the other hand, you're having to learn these different noun endings all at once. So either way, you kind of got you got a lot to learn, and it's often those early noun chapters that people find quite difficult. So you've got a different approach here to what you have with a lot of the grammars, and it's consistent with what you find in beginning with New Testament Greek as well. So that's the nouns. Anyway, I said too much about that. Let's move on. This approach to endings and the idea of having different endings actually becomes kind of a forming principle as you go through this grammar. This means that you're going to end up with verb endings that make sense together as well. For instance, the future active and the present active indicative are both put together. So you have those in the same chapter. The aorist and the imperfect verb forms are also found in the same chapter. And you can see and you can understand the rationale behind this because you're being introduced to consistent endings together. And that makes a lot of sense. So you see this not just in the nouns, but you see it in the verbs as well. Now again, the downside of this is that things like tense morphemes and things like that are thrown together with the endings, which in some other grammars are broken apart so that you're able to take a single tense form and look at exactly how it is built up, without having to learn all the stuff all at once. So this is really an interesting approach, and I think part of me wonders if this is going to be a little bit overwhelming for students. I don't know. I haven't been through it, and I'd really love to hear from you. If you've been through Dr. Black's grammar as a beginning Greek grammar, I would love to hear from you. Did you find that kind of element overwhelming? Did you find that where you have a lot of different stuff going on in one chapter like that, did you find that hard? Did you feel that by the time you got to the end of this grammar, you really understood the different tense forms and how they were formed and so on? I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment in the comment section below. Now, this is all part of, I think, Dr. Black's approach to trying to simplify the language down. And in addition to presenting verbs and nouns with consistent endings to try and do that, there are a number of other things he's done as well. Like, for instance, he's pretty much omitted any discussion about the optative except for me genoito, which is interesting. And I think if you're going to get into some books have got a lot of optatives in them, such as 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. So you really want to have a bit of an understanding of those before you get to them. And this would be one of those areas where I think probably would be good from a learning point of view, but then might catch up with you later on. There's also no discussion of things like future participles and future infinitives, which is fair enough given there's only 12 or so future participles in the New Testament. So some of these things I think are really helpful, and this is really a simplified approach to learning the language, which you can kind of see in the way it's been presented. Let's get into the strengths and weaknesses of this grammar, but before we do that, let me just ask you, if you're getting value from this and finding this helpful, hit the like button. That way it tells me that this video is helpful and it helps the YouTube algorithm know that other people will probably find this helpful. And while you're there, don't forget to hit the subscribe and the notify bell as well so you find out when new videos like this are released. So let's get into the strengths of this grammar. One of them, of course, is the speed at which you get into verbs. I really like that, and also you get into prepositions pretty quickly in chapter 5 and pronouns as well. Now, these are important because there's so many sentences in the Greek New Testament that have pronouns and prepositions in them. So having these early on makes a huge difference to the learner being able to get into at least some of the biblical texts, a little bit more quickly. Another great strength of this grammar is that it does have all the exercises built in. So there's no secondary workbook for this. It's all built in, and there is actually a supplemental workbook if you do want to use that. But everything is built in. You've got about 18 to 20 different translation exercises for most chapters, which is plenty for the average learner to sort of start to, figure out and see if they can actually take the principles they've learned in that chapter and use them in the real world. That's a great thing. And on top of that, you've also got the answer keys built in. It's in the appendix there. And so it's easy to get underway without having to buy an extra book. So this is great for self-studying. And also, the way these exercises are set up, Dr. Black has set them up so that you know the words, like if you're learning the vocabulary, then you know the words for all of the exercises in the grammar, so you're not going to be getting words that you don't know or that you have to look up, at least as far as I could tell. Like I said, another element of this grammar which I think is really helpful is that it is a simplified approach to the language. I think putting those endings together is an attempt to do that. I'm not sure how successful it is, but then the simplification by making the optatives a little bit easier and removing some of those things. There's not a lot in terms of Actian Sart and things like that in this that will confuse you. And there's a good helpful chapter at the end there that is probably going to introduce a number of those concepts that you'd want to have at the end of a beginning Greek course. So I think overall there's some good strengths here, but I'm just not entirely sure how some of these pan out in terms of a learning experience. And that brings me to some of the weaknesses, I think, of this grammar. The first one is deponency. This was written in 2009. Deponency was still a thing. It wasn't until 2010 or thereabouts that deponency really started to be one of those elements that's looked down. And if you want to find out more about deponency, well, I'll link to a video I did on that just up here so that you can find out all about it. And another element of this is, the discussion that we're having right now around time and the indicative mood. Again, this predates all of that discussion, really, although Constantine Campbell's book and a lot of the other books on verbal aspect had already been written at this stage, and Dr. Black takes that into account. So he does argue that verbal aspect is the primary point of a tense form, but he still argues that the augment reflects past tense. He still argues for time in the indicative, and I think this is not helpful and probably is one of those things that as time goes on will be a little bit like deponency, will be put to one side. Now, the other weakness I wonder about is just the quantity of information in some of these chapters. For instance, taking the future and the present tense verb forms together. Now, granted, at least you're kind of introduced to verbs very early, and that makes a big difference. But introducing multiple forms at once, I have a feeling that may be overwhelming. Same goes for the imperfect and the aorist. Now, if you're thinking about it from the point of view of time and you're arguing that the imperfect and the aorist tense forms are past tense, well, it kind of makes more sense because the two forms are just doing the same thing. They have the same endings. There's a slight difference between them, but other than that, they're much the same. And that kind of makes sense, but I prefer probably to separate those out and make them, teach them for what they actually are rather than sort of trying to conflate them. So I'm not sure whether this is going to be a good thing or not. I'm sort of edging on the side of this as possibly a weakness, but I'd love to hear from you and your view if you've been through this grammar. Leave a comment in the comment section below. Another issue with this, even though there's a lot of great exercises in this, for the first 18 chapters, a lot of those exercises are made up Greek. So they're not real Greek. Some of them are based on New Testament passages, but for the most part, they're not. And so you're really working with a 20th or 21st century author who's creating Greek passages, and I'm sure Dr. Black does a great job of that. But students really want to be into the text as early as possible. So why not do that for them? And this is what Dr. Merkel and Plummer have done. This is what Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek, and most grammars do this. They'll give you an exercise and then they'll give you a gloss for the words or the forms that you haven't learnt yet. And that's my preference as well, because again, you want the students to get into the text as quickly as possible. And so during those first 18 chapters, you've got a lot of made up text, and I think this is one of those things that I would rather have replaced, and maybe that's better in the supplemental workbook, but I don't have that, so I can't comment on that. Finally, I felt one thing that could have been better in this grammar would have been a little bit more focus on exactly what to learn. Now, there is the exercises, and in the exercises you get told, you want to go over some of these forms so that you understand them, but I don't know that that's enough guidance for a student. Most grammars now are starting to say, and have been saying for some time, you need to know this paradigm and you need to know it well because, right? And here's the reason why. A good example of this is third declension. Bill Mounce in Basics of Biblical Greek will argue that the third declension paradigm, you need to know that really well. The reason is that when it comes to participles, if you don't know your third declension, participles are going to be really hard. So you need to know that. So some of these things, some of that guidance I thought is missing from this grammar, and I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of that there as well. So in short, here's my summary of Black's Learn to Read New Testament Greek. I think this is a good grammar. It is a product of 2009. It's a product of its time by a great author who knows the language really well. I am concerned that there's a little bit too much crammed together in some of these chapters, that the simplification process that I think Dr. Black has tried to apply here may actually be unhelpful for a learner, particularly as they start to try and unravel some of those simplifications. But overall, it's probably a good crash course introduction into the language. So how would I use this grammar? Well, I would probably refer to this grammar as a sort of, if you were going to use it as a primary grammar and you were going to go through a course in a hurry as a teacher. So if you were going to do, say, Greek in 8 weeks or Greek in 16 weeks, for instance, maybe this would be a good grammar for that because it's got quite a lot of information. You could probably condense it down pretty easily into one semester, and that might be a good use for this course. I'm not sure that I would encourage its use alone because I don't know that it gives you enough guidance, and I don't know that I would use it as a reference because of the simplification. So I think this would be a great primary grammar for a short course, but I think you're going to need a second grammar to complement it and further explain some of the concepts in it. So that's my take on it. I'd be interested to hear what you think of this grammar. Leave a comment in the comment section below. And I've got some good stuff coming up. So now that I've done this grammar, I've been waiting to do this grammar for a little while. Now that I've finished Black's grammar, and coming up in a future video, I'm actually going to do a top 10 of all the grammars that I've looked at on the market and share those with you as well. And I'm going to put that all onto one page so that you can find all of my reviews and backgrounds and everything onto a single web page and as a resource for you to use them there. So look out for that in a coming video. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for liking and subscribing to this channel, and I look forward to serving you in the next video. Until then, keep taking small, consistent steps. We'll see you then.